Alright, so we are back, gonna resume chapter 8. So let's take a look at it. Last time we finished up talking about um, the Citizen Genet whole debacle and experience there, and how that went down for French-American relations. Now, we also have to understand that the French are not the only ones who are upset with the Americans. Or they're not the only ones who are making Americans upset, should I say. Okay, so the British upset Americans too. They disrespect our neutrality. And how did they do that? How do they disrespect our neutrality? Well, they begin impressing sailors and taking supplies. Okay, so they begin stopping American ships and impressing sailors and taking supplies. Like, they're literally taking stuff off the boats, and then they're looking at you, and you get on our boat. You're now in the British Navy. They're forcing American sailors, whether they were military sailors or not, more than likely they weren't. They're stopping merchant vessels. They're stopping vessels that were going to be bringing goods to France a lot of times. They'll stop those boats, force the people on them, or at least some of the people on there, to serve in the British Navy and take some of those supplies off the boat. So, again, France is not alone in upsetting America. The British did it as well. They disrespect our neutrality by impressing sailors and taking supplies. Also, we have problems with our forts in the Old Northwest. Again, around the Great Lakes, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, right? So we have problems with their forts in the Old Northwest because the troops that they have there, first of all, we're debating whether or not those areas are American or they're British territory. And then secondly, what are those troops who are there doing? They're working with the Native Americans to resist American movements. So we believe that they are helping the Native Americans fight the Americans. But George Washington avoids war because he knows we are not strong enough yet. Frankly put, George Washington recognizes we're not ready for another war. So he sends over John Jay to negotiate a treaty. He's like, look, we don't want to go to war. Let's negotiate. Let's try to figure something out. Let's put an end to this in a peaceful manner. So he sends John Jay, right, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, sends John Jay over there. Simply put, Jay's treaty, that's what it becomes known as, Jay's treaty was a failure. Okay, simply put, it was a failure, and it was extremely unpopular. The British didn't really follow it, and they said they would only pay back the debt of impressments and goods after we paid back our debts from the American Revolutionary War. Okay, so it's this big thing where, like, basically the treaty is not very good to begin with. Americans are not supportive of it. They don't like it. And then on top of it, the British basically say, yeah, we agree to pay this stuff back, but we're not paying it back until you pay us what you owe us. And so it's just a failure all the way around. So that's where we're at with the British. But then we get the Spanish. Okay, now we look at the Spanish. And we get lucky with Spain. They had been a big problem for the Americans because they were blocking our access to the mouth of the Mississippi River in New Orleans. They weren't giving us access to that part. And they were doing what? They were helping the Southern Indians resist American movement. So we get lucky with Spain. They had been a big problem for the Americans because they had blocked our access to parts of the Mississippi River and had been helping the Southern Indians. Now, with all of the problems going on in Europe, they start to pay less attention to what's happening in America. Long story short, there's a lot of problems back in Europe for them. So they're focused on that, and they are really not paying much attention to what's happening in the Americas. So Thomas Pinckney is sent over to get a treaty with Spain, and we get Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. It gave Americans access to the mouth of the Mississippi River and settled disputes about the southern U.S. border. It settled it at the 31st parallel. This is a big deal, and it is extremely popular within America. Now, I'm going to pull up a little map so you can see. Again, this whole territory, this orange stuff is American territory, but again, it's unorganized. It's that area that would ultimately be that land or the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, all that good stuff, right? So this is what's eventually going to become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, that region, right? We have some areas like up here in Maine and over here that are disputed between the Americans. But remember, the British own all of this stuff that's in white right here. That isn't water. Like, this is obviously water. But so there's debates over that. But down here, remember, after the Revolutionary War, when we got the Treaty of Paris 1783, we said that Americans had from the Mississippi River over and then from Florida up to the Great Lakes border with Canada, right? Well, we say we have this, but so do the Spanish. So this is disputed area, and they weren't letting us access the mouth of the Mississippi River. Well, long story short, after Pinckney's Treaty, this little area is designated, boom, it's no longer disputed. That is Americans. We settled this dispute at the 31st parallel. This bottom line right here, this darker pink color will now be considered American territory, and they let us go through that final little leg of the Mississippi River out into the Gulf of Mexico, right? So it is a huge deal. Pinckney's Treaty will ultimately be a big deal. It's super important, and it's super popular with the American people. And I just always like to think about the Spanish situation here, whereas they have problems. Like Europe is having a whole bunch of problems, and Spain is in Europe. So it's kind of like when you have problems at home, what's happening off at your neighbor's house doesn't really matter. But when everything's good at your own house and you're sitting out on the back porch, barbecuing and hanging out with friends, you pay attention to what's going on in at the neighbors' houses. But when you're inside your own home and there's a lot of conflict, brothers and sisters are screaming, yada yada yada, you don't have time to pay attention to what's going on in the world, right? So that's what happens, and ultimately it benefits the Americans with Pinckney's Treaty. Now, that brings us to an issue that happens here at home, the Whiskey Rebellion, right? So again, I know it's kind of out of order, because Pinckney's Treaty was 1795, Whiskey Rebellion is 94, but I just did all the foreign stuff first, and we'll look at this one domestic thing. Here in the Whiskey Rebellion. So, if you remember, Alexander Hamilton had put some taxes out to help pay for pay for the national debt, right? Tax the people, that way it shows force over the people, and we can repay our debts. So that was the issue. Now, Hamilton's taxes had put a big tax on liquor. This upset many frontiersmen because liquor was actually a big cash crop for them. And you say, well, how can liquor be a cash crop? Well, think about it. What do we make liquor out of? What do we make types of whiskey and other things out of? Corn, rye, apples, peaches. All of these are produce items. They are crops that can then be transformed into liquors, right? So all of this was used to make liquor. And also keep this in mind. What lasts longer? A bushel of apples or a barrel of apple cider, right? Like that idea of the liquor will last longer. So what we see is that the crops, a lot of times they would turn their crops into liquor. It lasted longer than the produce, so it was really great for these people. And in some places it even acted as currency. Again, think about it. If you live on the western side of those mountains, if I go back to this map and I pull it up, remember there's a mountain chain that kind of runs right about there, right? What we call the Appalachian Mountains, right in that region. Well, for the people who live on this side, if you are a farmer and you farm a product and you got to get it across the mountains, that could be very difficult. But then you say, well, what if we just put it on the Mississippi River and float it down? Well, what happens before Pinckney's Treaty signed and we can't make it all the way down, or even after? How long is that produce going to last if you sail it all the way down and around the coast, right? So what's going to be good, what's not going to be good, how are we playing with all those different things? So long story short, liquor had become this big thing. It wasn't just about the produce. Like, it wasn't just about liquor, like, oh, hey, we want a drink, and putting a tax at the bar room. It was about the production and whatnot of this alcohol. So again, it lasted longer than the produce they were farming, and it became currency for many people. So as these taxes ramp up, eventually the frontiersmen just can't take it anymore, and they begin causing chaos. It got so big, this chaos, this rebellion that begins, and this rebellion starts over here in some territories on the western side of Pennsylvania. So it really gets going over here. Now, with that in mind, this rebellion kind of got so amped up that eventually George Washington sends the military to stop to stop this rebellion. Y'all think about that. Here we have the president, George Washington, the leader of the national government, sending the military. Remember what was that critical event? What we said was that event that led from the Articles of Confederation to the constitutional government, that moment that in essence ended that rebound relationship we had, that told us, maybe this isn't going to work. It was Shays' Rebellion, right? People rebelled, and states came to protect the federal government. Here, we see the federal government stepping up. George Washington sending the military to stop the men. This is big because it showed the nation that the central government, the national government, had power and would not be pushed over. So again, the idea of Alexander Hamilton's taxes, showing the people we control them. This is big because it showed the nation the central government had power not only to charge taxes, but to enforce and collect those taxes, and it would not be pushed over. But it did have negative impacts for the Federalists, because the excessive force used endeared many people to Thomas Jefferson's agricultural Democratic Republicans. Remember, y'all, there are going to be people who are going to look back and say, you know, Washington, like, yes, rebellion, you didn't need to send the military, right? Like, maybe you could have toned it down a notch. Maybe you could have just sent a police force. Did we need to send the actual military, right? And so that becomes this issue that we're looking at, is some people believe that Washington used too much force. And actually, Alexander Hamilton rode with the troops. Like, he went out there with them to make sure that this rebellion was shut down. And so again, a lot of people, especially farmers, especially Western farmers, are going to start to say, look, maybe I like Jefferson. Maybe I like those Democratic Republicans who are more about farming and not as much about business and industry. So it showed the force of the national government. It solidified the idea that the national government was strong. But it also kind of hurt the Federalist Party, because now some people, especially farmers, agricultural people, will sit back and say, man, maybe they went too far. Maybe they used too much force. So we see that. Now, where does that put us? That brings us to a changing of the guards. So now in 1796, George Washington decides he's had enough. And after 2 terms, he decides he will not seek re-election. Okay? So 1796, George Washington decides he's had enough. 2 terms, he's done. So again, yeah, George Washington decides he's had enough. After 2 terms, he's done. He will not seek re-election. He decides to retire to his home in Mount Vernon. In his farewell speech, in his farewell address, he acknowledged the positives of political parties, but warned of the division they can cause. Now keep this in mind, y'all. Washington almost always sided with Hamilton. So when he says, be wary of political parties, is he really saying, why don't we all, do what Hamilton says? Follow what Hamilton says. He's on the right path. Is he saying that, or is he really saying, look, be wary of them? Be wary of political parties. So looking at those things, trying to decipher what he's actually getting at there. But also, in this farewell address, he warned about the problems that can come from permanent alliances with foreign governments, like the one we're in with France. So he talks about the good that political parties can do. It's good to have diverse ideas. But he warns of the division they can cause. Tell me a time in your lifetime, that America has not been divided along political party lines, right? And a lot of us will sit back and say, well, I'm neutral, or I'm in the middle, or whatever. But we see a lot of division along party lines. So Washington gets that pretty correct there. He also says, be wary of permanent alliances with foreign nations. Basically, he's saying, look, if we align ourselves with these foreign countries, we'll get dragged into their wars. And we need to be careful of that. So don't just go, joining up with everybody who needs something. Make sure that alliance is something that either A, is only temporary, or B, we can find a way out of later on. Now, that brings us to the election of 1796. We see division along party lines, just like Washington warned us about. But so in 1796, we see division along party lines. The Democratic Republicans choose Thomas Jefferson as their leader. No surprise there. The Federalists will go with John Adams. Why don't they go with Hamilton? Well, long story short, y'all, Hamilton had upset too many people. What's one of the things about politics? You upset a lot of people. And eventually, you might get to a point where you've upset too many people. And that's where Hamilton was. Hamilton, long story short, had just upset too many people. And so ultimately the Federalists will go with John Adams. Now John Adams wins but it is extremely close, y'all. He wins 71 to 68. He beats Jefferson 71 to 68. But what's that mean? That means that Jefferson is going to be Adams' vice president. Now, y'all understand this, and I don't want to overly complicate it, but there was a way for them to have a president and a vice president kind of locked. There was like first place votes and second place votes kind of thing. There was a way for John Adams to have somebody who would have been more like him, that wouldn't have been his number one opponent, Thomas Jefferson, be his vice president. There was a way for that. But because Hamilton tried some sneaky tactics to get someone else elected over John Adams, someone he could control, ultimately we see that Thomas Jefferson runs in here with the second place vote. So the way it was supposed to work was that for the Federalists, they were going to elect John Adams, and then they were going to put a bunch of their second place votes for, or they were going to not rig the vote, but they were going to vote a certain way to get Adams as the president and this other guy as their vice president. Well, what happened is that because Hamilton knows he couldn't control Adams, y'all, John Adams, good or bad, was a man of his own mind, right? Like, he is not going to say anything, like he was not going to be controlled by another person. He would listen to everybody, but he would make his own decisions. And he was not going to be controlled by Hamilton. And Hamilton and Adams didn't always get along. They didn't always see eye to eye. Again, if you watch the HBO miniseries John Adams, there's this part. It's one of my favorite lines. There's a time when Adams and Hamilton are kind of at odds, and Adams just looks at Hamilton and says, "Are you crazy? Either you're stark raving mad or I am. I bid you good day, sir," and basically just kicks him out of the room. And so it's this really interesting thing. So they don't always get along. So Hamilton tries some sneaky tactics to put somebody over Adams, somebody that ultimately Hamilton believes he can control. It doesn't work out. Adams still wins the presidency, but instead of having a vice president that would work with him well, he gets Thomas Jefferson. Yo, Adams and Jefferson had been great friends. During the American Revolution, they had become great friends. Here, once John Adams becomes president and Jefferson will follow, they will have an extreme falling out. Their friendship will get rocked. Then later on in their lives, they will reconnect. Yo, there are very few people who have more incredible timing than John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Okay, this is off topic, but it's something I'll mention here because I just want to make sure I talk about it. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, these two great founding fathers, part of the early Continental Congress, helped with the Declaration of Independence, helped them, they are both in France at different times. Long story short, they're great friends, then they have this big falling out. Then later on in their lives, they reconnect as friends. They write each other a bunch of letters and they reconnect as friends. They also have impeccable timing because both of them died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's just an incredible thing. So when we look at it, their lives are always going to be connected. But nonetheless, so we see that John Adams wins the presidency. Now, let's look at what his presidency was like. Y'all, I told you I'm a big fan. I love to study John Adams and his son John Quincy Adams. They have really interesting lives. What I also will say without reservation is that both of those men were really, really great at a lot of different things. Their presidencies did not go well. John Adams ultimately will not have his presidency will not be looked at as this great time. Okay, but let's break it down. Okay, so who is John Adams? He's not quite George Washington or Hamilton, but he's not Thomas Jefferson either. He's a Federalist, but he's more Federalist than Democratic Republican, but he's fairly balanced. He gets elected by the Federalists, and he is the only person to go down in history as being a Federalist president. Remember, George Washington didn't have a political party to run on. So he's a Federalist, but he's very much a middle-of-the-road Federalist. He's extremely smart and very level-headed. He always believed in justice and the law. Remember, he is the lawyer for those soldiers during the Boston Massacre trials, right? So he always believes in justice and the law. Again, he was extremely smart, very level-headed. One of his biggest successes will also be seen as a big failure. Like John Adams, something that he sees as personally is one of his greatest achievements. He will say, like, I want this on my headstone. It's so important to him. Many other people look at it as a huge failure. So one of his biggest successes will also be seen as a big failure. He also brought some problems on himself because he kept Washington's cabinet. Like, he was elected president and he didn't change the cabinet. No, the cabinet is supposed to be your most trusted advisors. Well, he doesn't change it. And that brings us to a really interesting thought. We always talk about how hard and how difficult it must have been for a person like George Washington to be the first ever whatever. Right? First ever president. Anytime you're the first one to do something, it's really hard. And you kind of set the trend for everybody else to follow. But also remember, it's really hard to be the second person. Like, how do you follow up George Washington? Was there anything that John Adams could do? Remember, John Adams, to that point in time, had probably done just as much as anybody else in the effort for American independence. But can he compete with George Washington in everybody else's eyes? So anything he does is not going to be John Adams. You always hear people about what's it like to be the guy who follows the guy. Like, you see these great, incredible coaches who coach for years and win championships and do all this stuff. And then what's it like to be the coach who takes over when that guy retires? Like, how do you do that? How do you take over? How do you do these sorts of things, right? So all of that kind of comes into play. And as much as we talk about there's no guidebook for George Washington of like, okay, this is how you act as a president. There was no guidebook for John Adams to say, well, can I change this? I mean, Washington did that way. Do I have to do it that way, or can I change it? So ultimately he keeps Washington's cabinet, but he's using somebody else's advisors as his own. And so ultimately that doesn't go well. So what are some of the things that happened during his administration? Well, the first thing we get is going to be the XYZ affair. Following Jay's Treaty, so Jay's Treaty is with the British. Following Jay's Treaty, the French are upset because they see this as a violation of their rights. So the French are upset because we signed a treaty with the British. Americans are like, why are you upset? It's a crappy treaty. We don't even like it. It sucks. But the French are said, well, you still made a deal with them. Why you didn't make a deal with us? So the French are upset because they see Jay's Treaty as a violation of their rights. Why aren't the Americans going to help them? Why aren't the Americans still going to work with the French? So they decide to start attacking American ships just like the British had done a couple years ago. They say that they would kill any American found on a British ship too. So now what do we have? We have the British who had been impressing American sailors, forcing Americans off of American boats onto British boats. Now the French are saying if they find an American on a British boat, they're going to kill them. Now we can't win. Our people are being kidnapped by this group, and then when that group stops this group, they kill the people that had been kidnapped. Like, how do we win? So obviously the Americans are very upset with this. So John Adams will send a delegation to Paris to work things out. He sends 3 men, the leader of which is going to be John Marshall. John Marshall is a name we're going to remember for quite some time in this class, so get used to it. So Adams sends 3 men to Paris to work this out. Their group is led by John Marshall. When they get to Paris, they had to wait around to meet with the French officials. And finally, they're told before any negotiations are to be held, they would have to pay a $250,000 bribe. Now, who tells them this? John Adams knows. John Adams doesn't, John Adams will report all of this to Congress. But when he reports it to Congress, he labels those 3 French people as agents X, Y, and Z. So we call this the XYZ affair. Okay, so our 3 men, John Marshall and the 2 others, are told by these French guys, Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z, look, you want to go talk to our leader? You want to sit at the big kid table? You need to cough up some money. Grease the palms a little bit. Give us $250,000, and then we'll let you in to talk with the leader. Then we'll let you talk with him. Okay? Well, the Americans are outraged by this. Again, X, Y, and Z were 3 French officials that Adams kept anonymous. When Adams tells this whole story to Congress in a letter, he leaves those French officials anonymous. He refers to them as agents X, Y, and Z. Okay, so the Americans are told before any negotiations are held, they would have to pay a $250,000 bribe. This was not uncommon. Like, y'all, this wasn't radically crazy or totally uncommon to see at this time. Like, look, you want to sit at the big kid table, you gotta pay your weight, right? But it upset many Americans. The Americans are just personally affronted, like, we can't believe they asked us. Again, was it completely uncommon at that time? No, it wasn't. But the Americans are going to use it as a thing of like, hey, you can't do that. That's not fair. That's not right. And remember, y'all, John Adams is a Federalist. He might be a modern, but he's a Federalist. And they are pro-British, anti-French, right? So all of the Federalists are going to be like, see, the French are corrupt. They're trying to do these horrible things. So now many Americans upset and want a war. Even some Democratic Republicans supported war. And they were the ones who liked France. So even many of the Democratic Republicans, a group of people who often supported France, even wanted war. But Adams doesn't ask for a declaration of war. He doesn't feel it's justified. Adams ultimately says, I don't think it's necessary for us to go to war. I mean, they asked us for a bribe. They didn't like attack us or anything. So he doesn't feel it's justified and wants to make sure the nation has a reason and could handle the war before he asks for a declaration. But Congress decides to act, and they start they start an informal war, what we call the quasi-war, okay, or the quasi-war. Basically, we don't declare war, but we stop trade with France, and we authorize the capture of French ships, and we renounce the Treaty of Alliance from 1778. So Congress authorizes the quasi-war. We stop trade with France, we authorize the capture of French ships, and we renounce the 1778 Treaty of Alliance. Since we are doing this, Adams uses it as an opportunity to build up the Navy from less than 5 ships. When y'all understand this, when John Adams took over the presidency, when he gets elected in 1796, the American Navy has less than 5 boats, has less than 5 ships. By the time he leaves office, 4 years later, they have over 30. So he uses this as a way to build up the Navy. Y'all, that's a very Federalist idea. Remember, the Federalists wanted a strong Navy. So it builds up the Navy from less than 5 ships to over 30. Now, the French minister, Charles de Talleyrand, asks for the Americans to come back. He's like, look, y'all, we're sorry about all this. Why don't you come back? Let's talk about it. So the French minister, Charles de Talleyrand, asks for the Americans to come back so he can talk more. But by the time the Americans get to Paris, Talleyrand is out of office. Remember, y'all, we're still in the French Revolution. They keep changing leaders. So the French Revolution has another shift here, and Talleyrand is out of power by the time the Americans get back. A new person by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte is in power. He talks with the Americans, and we get the end of the Quasi-War and the Treaty of Alliance. Napoleon is very focused on Great Britain. So he's like, Americans, yeah, whatever, I don't care. I don't want to deal with you, so you go stay over there. Oh, you want to end the Quasi-War? Great. You want to end the Treaty of Alliance? Okay, awesome, fine. I don't really want to deal with you. I'm trying to conquer Great Britain. I'm trying to beat Britain, so let me deal with that. That's kind of his mentality. So again, Talleyrand is out of office by the time the Americans return. Napoleon Bonaparte is now in power. He speaks with the Americans. We get into the Quasi-War and to the Treaty of Alliance because he's focused on Great Britain. Now, parties going bad. Okay, we look at some domestic issues and how parties will ultimately go bad here. Starting back in Washington's terms, parties had developed, as we said, and they started causing problems. Jefferson was really upset with all of the Federalists and even John Adams. He even had someone write negative pamphlets about Adams and Adams's monarchist views. One of the big criticisms of John Adams will be that he wants things too much like the old monarchy, that he spent a little time in Europe, and that he wants the president to have so much power and basically be like a king. Remember the title he came up with for the president? So he's looking at all of those things, and people say he aligns himself too much with the British. He wants things too much like the British. He wants a kingdom, and he has monarchical views. So again, Jefferson was really upset with all the Federalists, and John Adams even had someone write negative pamphlets about Adams and his monarchist views. This happens despite being invited by Adams to work as a bipartisan team. So Adams, during the when George Washington was president, John Adams was vice president. Washington kind of excluded Adams a little bit. Like Adams was not always allowed in, because the way Washington saw it was that he picked his cabinet. He didn't pick John Adams. So John Adams was left out of some things. Well, John Adams recognizes that Jefferson is a great mind and appreciates what he does, so he tries to work him in. So Adams tries to do that, but their beliefs are a little too different at this time, and ultimately their friendship will suffer. Now, again, Adams wanted this because he felt it was important not to side, or not to always pick one side. He wanted to try to be impartial. Adams really fought to make sure that he remained impartial. He often sided with, or I say often, but he was a Federalist, that he leaned that way, but he tried to be impartial and try to think about everything. Again, it didn't always work, but he often tried. Now, because of the French problems, the Federalists will try to strengthen their hold on politics. Because of all these things we see happening with France, the Federalists will try to take control of politics a little bit more forcefully. So they will try to strengthen their hold on politics. They will pass with Adams' approval. Now they pass these things with Adams' approval. This is one of Adams' biggest failures. Okay, undoubtedly one of his biggest failures. He agrees to these things. They pass with his approval the Alien and Sedition Acts, and there's the Alien Act, there's the Sedition Act, there's another one that we call the Naturalization Act. A lot of people just lump them all together and call them the Alien and Sedition Acts. So, for the Federalists to strengthen their hold on politics, they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act said that we could deport aliens in peacetime and wartime at the discretion of the president. So again, aliens, immigrants, right? We're not talking little green men aliens. We're talking immigrants to the country. They're saying the president, whenever the president wants, whether it's peacetime or wartime, the president can deport aliens at any point in time at his discretion. That was the Alien Act. Then we will get the Sedition Act. People, under the Sedition Act, people were fined or arrested if you said or did anything bad about or to the government. You could not riot or publish negative material about the government. Yo, that's harsh. Yo, in that situation, over the last, I don't know, let's call it 8 years, in the last 8 years, 8, 10, 20, however long you want to go, how often has somebody said something bad about the government? Had said something bad about the president, made fun of the president? It doesn't matter if it's Republican, Democrat, people have, so how many people in today's day and age would be either fined or arrested if you said or did something bad about or to the government? Couldn't riot or publish negative material about the government or the president. And that might be one thing if it was carried out evenly across the board. But what we saw here is that more often than not, the people who were impacted by that law were Democratic Republicans. Then we also have the Naturalization Act. It pushed citizenship. The process, like the amount of time it took for you to go from an immigrant to a citizen, it pushed that time from 5 years to 14 years. So the process to become a citizen went from 5 years to 14 years. Why would they do that? Okay, let's look at it. Most of your immigrants coming in got involved in farming. Most of them were going to join Jefferson in the Democratic Republicans. So what are these laws doing? They're really hurting the Democratic Republicans and helping the Federalists. Okay, well, you're an immigrant, you come over, you're not just going to immediately you're not going to get to vote within 5 years. It's going to take 14, 15 years before you're able to vote when you get citizenship. You're going to come over, you're going to talk bad about the government, you're going to talk bad about the Federalists, we're going to arrest you, we're going to do this. Now, the Sedition Act in particular, is that a violation of the First Amendment? You bet it is. You bet it is. But what goes on, y'all? Think about this. A lot of times we let something that's wrong go out of fear. So I'll give you this example. Following September 11th, how many people engaged in profiling or were profiled because you're walking through an airport and you see somebody who appears to be of Middle Eastern descent? You walk through an airport. No, following September 11th, you're walking through an airport and you see somebody who looks Middle Eastern. Did those people get profiled? Did it make it right? No, but because there was that sense of fear that something was going to happen, another attack might be on the horizon. What happened? Americans were kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. Again, following September 11th, we started to see things where the government maybe started to try to monitor people's actions a little bit more. And so people are like, well, that's an invasion of my privacy. And other people are like, you know, dude, I want to make sure we don't have another major attack, so I'm okay with them invading my privacy a little bit. So a lot of times people are okay with giving up some of those rights, okay? And that's another theme that I want to bring forward from here on out. You know, we've talked about the first theme that I talked about in this course was that idea of consensual self-government. The Americans are deciding for themselves that they're going to govern one another. Right? We saw that leading up until the point of the American Revolution. Well, now that we're here, we have this new idea, this new and this different concept that's going to govern a lot of what Americans go through. It's the idea of freedom versus security, or liberty versus order. It's two different ways to think about it. Freedom and liberty, two words that are pretty synonymous, and security and order. Okay, and there's a balance between those things, y'all. Think about, most societies have a balance between freedom and security, or what we call liberty and order. And the way I want you to think about it is, think about a scenario where there is complete and total order, complete and total security, maybe a maximum security prison. Is there any real freedom in a maximum security prison? No, not really. So we have security way up here, we have freedom down here. Let's go on the opposite side of that. If we want to go all freedom, no security. Maybe if you've watched the movies The Purge, right? Total anarchy, total chaos. You have total freedom, but there's no security, there's no safety, right? So where do we find that balance? The balance of liberty versus order, security versus freedom, liberty versus order, or security versus freedom, right? Freedom and security, liberty and order. How are we balancing those? On one side we have freedom and liberty, on the other side we have security and order. Ultimately, how are we going to balance those things? So, and that's what I'm getting at. The Sedition Act definitely is a violation of the First Amendment, but at that point in time, some people were kind of okay with it. Like, yeah, we're scared of all these immigrants coming in, so we're going to kind of restrict it, right? Now, the point of the laws was to keep immigrants out. They tended to join Democratic Republicans, and the Federalists wanted to make it tough for the Democratic Republicans to gain power. Okay? So obviously, these Alien and Sedition Acts are blatantly obvious efforts by the Federalists to try to control and limit Democratic Republican power. In response to this, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are going to be so upset that they write these things called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions, which claim that the states created the Constitution, and therefore the states were the final judges on whether or not federal law was constitutional. It's like saying, like, look, we the states created the Constitution, so we the states determine if laws are legal or not the Supreme Court. But the Federalists say it was the people who created the Constitution, so the Supreme Court gets to decide whether or not things are legal. Interesting little thing, y'all, when we look at the beginning of the Constitution, what's called the preamble, right? It says, we the people. So did the people create it? The original drafts said, we the United States. So it's this interesting thing of how people look at this stuff. Again, and what I find interesting, y'all, is here you have James Madison, who is the author, the architect, like the main draftsman of the Constitution. He's the dude who wrote it, and you have people trying to tell him, no, that's not what it means. He's the guy who wrote it, right? But again, it goes back to this idea that, we can all look at poetry, we can all look at song lyrics, whatever you want to find, and we can read the same words and get different meanings out of them from person to person. Well, here you have James Madison, the guy who's largely responsible for writing the Constitution, and people are arguing with him about what it says and about what it means. He's like, I think I know what it means. I'm the one who wrote it. So I always find that interesting. But again, So we have these things, the Alien Sedition Acts. Again, these are obviously blatant attempts by the Federalists to try to control the Democratic Republicans, and it's a bad look. It's a bad look for all of them, in particular John Adams, because he's the president at the time. Jefferson, this is some of that stuff that really starts to break that relationship between Adams and Jefferson, because Jefferson looks out and says, John, you signed it, you're doing all this stuff, you know it's wrong, like, why are you doing this? But yet, Jefferson had been writing negative things and had been having local newspapers publish negative stories about John Adams. Now, think about that. The vice president was having newspapers and other entities publish negative material about the president. That's not normal. That was extremely odd, extremely rare, and it showed a lot of dissension. But again, here, Jefferson and Madison issued the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which said the states created the Constitution, therefore the states were the final judges on whether or not federal law was constitutional. But the Federalists say it's the people who created the Constitution, so the Supreme Court gets to decide whether or not things are legal. Jefferson and Madison are saying states created the Constitution, states decide on legality. Federalists are saying no, the people created the Constitution, so the Supreme Court decides if things are legal. This argument that gets going between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans gets so big, it turns into such a big debate that we will legitimately have a fight in Congress. We will have a legitimate fight in Congress. This is an artist drawing of it. We see in Congress Matthew Lyon and Roger Griswold will attack one another. Roger Griswold is the guy over here with the cane. He attacks with a cane against Matthew Lyon. Matthew Lyon defends himself with some fire poker tong thing looking things, right? So again, Roger Griswold attacks with the cane. Matthew Lyon defends himself with the fire tong. So it's just this really just interesting thing. Now, that brings us to the Revolution of 1800. Okay, brings us to the Revolution of 1800. This is known as the election. It actually is the election of 1800, but it becomes known as the Revolution of 1800. And I'll explain that in a minute. So, there are tons of negatives for the Federalists and John Adams, but he had a little bit of hope. He still had a chance, right? He had a little bit of hope because we're still having problems with France. And if he asked for a declaration of war, if he chose to go to war with the French, the Federalists would probably have enough support and maybe even help re-elect him. But he opted for peace because he knew it was best for the nation. He believed it was best for the nation. This is that moment where John Adams, he believes this is his greatest success. But many people see it as a great failure. Because what happens here is, ultimately, John Adams will lose the election of 1800. But in the year 1800, he kept the Americans out of war with France. And he said that. He said, let it be known, let it be written on my headstone, that John Adams in the year 1800 kept the United States out of war with France. That was such an important thing to him, because he really believed that it was not in the best interest of the country to go to war. Now, if he would have asked Congress for a declaration of war and went to war, there's a decent chance, there's a really good chance he could have won the election of 1800. But knowing, and this is one of the things that I've always personally admired about John Adams. John Adams knew that going to war with France would help him win the election. But he believed, whether he was right or wrong, he believed going to war with France was not good for the country. So he chose doing what he believed was best for the country over doing what was best for him, getting him reelected. It's not, we live in a day and age where we always wonder about people's motives. We wonder about politicians. Are they doing this because they actually believe it, or are they just doing, here John Adams did something that hurt his chances at getting elected. But he did it because he believed it was the right thing to do. Was it right? Was it wrong? That's up for history to debate. But ultimately, I find that inspiring. So nonetheless, he opted for peace because he believed it was best for the nation. That, along with the fact that Hamilton won't support him, is going to be his downfall. The fact that Hamilton doesn't help him, doesn't work for him. Again, in the 1796 election, Hamilton tried to get somebody over Adams. Because Adams doesn't have Hamilton's support, that, along with the issues in France, he will not win re-election. Now, Jefferson is running in with Aaron Burr kind of as as the guy they want to be his number two, to be his vice president. So Jefferson is running with Aaron Burr as his running mate. And I use that term loosely because running mates today aren't what they were back then. Or what they were back then is not what they are today. So Jefferson is running again with Aaron Burr to be his vice president. Jefferson had his own problems. Okay, there are many stories and personal attacks that come out. The first publicity around the Sally Hemings story. If you're unaware, there are the stories, and what there are a lot of people who believe different things, whatever. But the stories are that Jefferson's wife had died when they were relatively young, and he never remarried. But according to some accounts, Jefferson ended up having a relationship, not getting married, but having a relationship and fathering children with one of his slaves by the name of Sally Hemings. So all of those stories start to come out. If you think politics in today's day and age are brutal, the election of 1800 is pretty rough. You have John Adams being called out, being a monarchist, and basically the American people being told that he doesn't want them, he's violating their First Amendment rights, and yada yada yada. And then you have people telling you that Jefferson is fathering children with his slaves. Those are bombshell allegations. Those are huge things. So again, Jefferson's running, but he has his own problems. Ultimately, what we see is that John Adams isn't really going to make a big push. But there's some things that happen, and we actually get a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. It will eventually be settled in the House of Representatives, and Thomas Jefferson will win. But here's what's interesting, the way the Constitution was written, again, whoever came in first was president, whoever came in second was vice president. Well, the issue here is that, how can I put it? Everybody knew Jefferson was supposed to be president and Burr was supposed to be a vice president. But we'll talk about this later on. Aaron Burr is a dude who is very, very power hungry, really, really wants to have power. And so when all the results get revealed, and he's like, wait, we tied? He was always supposed to be vice president, but he's like, wait, I got a chance to be president? You're telling me there's a chance. Awesome. And so he tries to fight and claw, and he tries to become president over Jefferson, when everybody else is like, no, man, like, somebody screwed something up. Jefferson's supposed to be vice president. Jefferson's supposed to be president. You're supposed to be vice president, right? That's the way it was supposed to be. Ultimately, this election will be decided in the House of Representatives, and Jefferson will win. But this will cause the 12th Amendment to be passed, which provided for party tickets, which is what we have now. So again, y'all, it took them a while to figure out the whole first place is president, second place is vice president thing. But here, after the election of 1800, we had saw the 11th Amendment, which I'm just going to kind of gloss over, y'all, is the lawsuits against states, yada, 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 don't worry about it. But here we get the 12th Amendment. 12th Amendment is going to be passed as a result of this, as a result of the election of 1800, aka the Revolution of 1800. We will get the 12th Amendment, which provided for party tickets. So from that point on, what happened is that when you voted for a group of people. You voted for a ticket, right? So, just like in any presidential election we see now, you vote for, there's like one button to press for this person to be president and vice president. It's not two separate votes, right? I'm voting for these two people to be president and vice president, and I know which one it is to begin with, right? So again, if we're looking at the election of 2020, I'm recording these videos in 2020, so if we look at that, there's one button to pick for Trump and Pence, and there's another button to pick for Biden and Harris, right? It's not two different votes for the two different positions. It's all one, and we get that with the 12th Amendment being passed. Now, why is the election of 1800 referred to as the Revolution of 1800? Well, think about it, y'all. Washington, well, he didn't have a political party. He almost always sided with Hamilton, who was the leader of the Federalists. Then John Adams comes in, and John Adams is a Federalist, right? He's middle of the road. He's not Hamilton, but he's still a Federalist. And then Jefferson gets elected. Jefferson wins the election of 1800. What did we just see? We saw a shift in power from one group of people to another group of people. And y'all, there was no bloodshed. There was no violence. It wasn't even as, we talked about the Glorious Revolution in previous chapters. It wasn't even as destructive as the Glorious Revolution. It was truly a revolution, a change, a shift in power from one group of people to a different group of people who have very different ideas, very different philosophies and ideologies. And that's one of the things that the Founding Fathers set up. That's an incredible thing about the United States, is we in essence can have a revolution, not just an election, but we can have a revolution every 4 years if we want. Think about the changes you've seen throughout your life of who has been present and what political parties have been in power at different times, Again, the shift from, just looking at people since the year 2000, the shift from President George W. Bush to President Obama, then from President Obama to President Trump, right? Seeing the shift from those different people. And it has been, in many cases, it has been a revolution. So it's interesting to see. And that is where we wrap up chapter 8. And next time we will look at chapter 9. But that finishes it up for chapter 8. I'll see y'all next time.